Hey, good morning, guys. Hope everybody's doing well. Today will be short and sweet. We're just going to kind of take a look at the final portion of Section 2 dealing with the Great Depression and kind of the lead up into the rise of these totalitarian leaders. And what we'll wrap up with is kind of discussing the OG fascist leader known as Benito Mussolini and his kind of rise to power in the nation of Italy following World War I. So where we'll start here is in the post-war kind of era within Europe. What we're dealing with is obviously the dismantlement of the German military, but more importantly, kind of the armament of some of those Allied powers that were looking to, in some shape or fashion, not only deter the Germans from trying to attempt to reinstate their military in the coming years, but also to really kind of fortify the defensive positions throughout Europe. And mainly what we see is one of those fortifications is kind of the design of what is known as the Maginot Line. Now, this was a kind of a joint effort between the British and as well as the French to really kind of ironclad this barrier between what is today kind of the modern day border of Belgium and France and Germany. But at that point, that was all German-held territory. So it was all about kind of keeping the Germans out of French territory as well as keeping the Germans and their goods from really kind of oversaturating the marketplaces within Europe. This was all about keeping the French military strong in a position of what I would consider strength. All right, but it was more about posturing strength. Even though they had the best laid plans, their execution of this armament and this fortification was really not well. Now, where they actually began this heavily fortified barrier was in the southern portions of France, kind of more in your wine-growing areas, all the way up through the southern portions of Germany. Now, this heavy red line really kind of illustrated where they tried to put this heavy fortification. Now, the original idea was then they would then continue this, but as we have come to find out, with massive economic depression, when the money runs out, you can't necessarily continue construction. So following the Great Depression, which we're going to talk about, what we see is that these fortifications, the heavy fortification stops, and then they just try to kind of create this little weak barrier as more of a deterrent than anything else. And that will be one of the fatal flaws that allows not only Hitler to exploit that when he moves into France and when he does commandeer not only Paris, but also just pretty much the entirety of the continental European area, but also he uses kind of what is a perceived strength as a weakness. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So as we got out of World War I, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, and really kind of the basic idea was let's blame Germany for not only everything, but let's also make them responsible for the entire amount of money through reparations. Now, we talked about that $33 billion and all of those things. But moving forward out of the Treaty of Versailles, we got through the mid-20s, and what kind of we saw is this economic boom, not only in the Americas, but also in Europe. Germany and France needed to kind of do a little bit of polishing of their expectations as we moved into the modern era. So in 1925, Germany and France promised, kind of as a non-aggressive pact, to never make war against each other in what is known as the Locarno Pact. Now, the Locarno Pact, while it's not extremely, I guess you want to say, well regarded, this kind of begins that snowball effect that eventually leads to what is known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now, as a part of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, Germany was admitted into the League of Nations, so that's a plus for them. And we start to see that most every nation within Europe, as well as some of the surrounding areas in Africa and Asia, all start to basically disarm. All right, they're all going to agree to renounce war as an instrument of national policy, and they're going to kind of set themselves on a stage for not necessarily agreement, but we'll say partnerships. And this was more built off of the economic need and the supply and demand that was kind of the 1920s into the 1930s. But as we know, all right, that economic bubble will burst in the late 1920s with not only the United States' Great Depression, but also that depression that is probably even more going to heavily impact places like Germany, places like Austria, that were already really at a disadvantage because of the situation that they were in, being responsible for a lot of those reparations from World War I. Now, we do see the disarmament happens, and this is going to be a major issue moving forward because, as we talked about in a couple of chapters ago, with not only Japan militarizing, but also we start to see the aggressive fascism and the kind of vanguard of the communists starting to spread. There is no kind of ironclad fist to put a stop to that. So that was one of the major, huge weaknesses of the League of Nations, is those really allied nations had nothing to stand in the way of not only Japan, but also the rise of Italy, the rise of Germany and Hitler. We'll see Francisco Franco in Spain do the same thing. There's just a number of incidents here where that aggressive streak that was needed to put a halt to some of these totalitarian type of approaches wasn't actually there. All right, and that weakness is obviously going to be exploited by these dictators around the world. All right, until someone steps up and tells them no, they're going to continue to keep pushing forward, and they're going to be very aggressive and very forceful with that. Now, economically, all right, what we know is that because of technology, we know that accessibility to goods is not going to be a problem, but it's going to be more about the debt. And one of the fatal flaws economically that we see around the world is the beginning of usage of credit, and what they're going to refer to as buying on margin at that point in time. Now, Germany was already really kind of weighed down by the reparations, and that situation is only going to grow worse and worse as we get deeper and deeper into the 1920s. Yes, they're able to produce these goods, but they're not getting a whole lot of profits back because those profits are all going towards the reparations. So there's not a lot of rebuilding of Germany. They're very bare bones, and the people's needs aren't really being met. All right, so that leads to a lot of distrust, a lot of anger, and just bad sentiment in general. And those European countries make shaky economic recoveries during the 20s, and they get a little bit too zealous, overzealous, with the type of spending they do. They don't put a whole lot in reserves, and because of that, when the economy does crash, they have no safety net. All right, now the United States, as we know, emerges as the world's leading economic power, and they're going to be doing well. They're going to be doing great, but they themselves are also going to have problems because even though, yes, they're able to produce all these goods and meet the demand around the world, eventually technology outpaces what you actually need demand-wise, and then you end up with a big surplus of goods, and the value of those goods goes way, way down. All right, so when you are making tons of things that aren't very valuable, you end up kind of shrinking your profit margins. All right, and that all starts to come into focus as we get into the British 1926 general strike, all right, where we see the impact of what happens when industry shuts down for a period of time. And as we're experiencing right now in the present day, we see what happens when businesses aren't open, people aren't spending money, all right, and there's that just general trickle-down effect to everything, all right? When you don't need, all right, things to be made, then there's no jobs that need to be fulfilled, and then it just kind of continues to spiral down and down and down and down and down. So with the falling demand due to overproduction, all right, we really start to see that kind of the unskilled workers and the agricultural workers, they didn't share in the boom of the United States economic kind of recovery after World War I. All right, when the war ended, the demand for war supplies is over, and we had already kind of retrofitted a lot of those factories to make the planes and the bullets and the tanks. And now with that not being, a big draw, you needed to then take all of those machines back. All right, that takes money. It takes kind of retrofitting, and you're going to put everything back to the way it was. So in effect, you have to kind of really waste money to get yourselves back on track to create the consumer goods that you were originally creating prior to the war. So those who produce the raw materials are going to end up earning less and buying less, right? And that results in kind of not only a mass shortage of the raw materials, but it also deals with the value of products continues to go down. That's only going to be aggravated by more overproduction, right? Because those goods are being created at a much higher rate than the demand actually calls for it, all right? And that was just something that we didn't have the foresight to think about. All right, so as the demand for slow factories cuts back on production, workers lose jobs, and then as we know, all right, kind of the inevitable is going to happen. You're going to have an economic crash, money's going to go away, it's going to dry up, and we're going to be in the position where not only the massive majority of your population are in breadlines, but in great need, but you start to really see that the structure of your economy as well as your society was heavily bent on spending. So when that fateful day does begin to happen in the late 1920s, we know that stock prices were kind of artificially inflated because everybody was buying on margin. Right? We had the United States president at that point, Herbert Hoover, all right, who was not discouraging so much credit going out the door to the typical average American, this wild buying stocks on borrowed money. And then we starting to see the debt that people are accumulating is going to heavily outweigh what their actual income potential is. Right? And we know that buying on margin, while it is risky and it can pay dividends, right, for the majority of people, right, it's just a major death blow. Right? It's basically you're playing Russian roulette, right, with your money. And in many cases, these people lose and lose mightily. So even though they believed they were going to get rich quick, the American attitude of kind of that life of excess really starts to come into focus as we get later in the 1920s. And then eventually, because people had increased their personal debt to such a huge amount, all right, it was inevitable that the economy was going to go over the cliff. So we start to see that because of those get-rich-quick schemes, all right, the stock market mainly only is going to be able to benefit the rich because they were the only ones that had the disposable income to be able to throw large sums into the stock market, play that game. So by 1929, 0.1% of the population held almost 35% of the country's total savings. And that's a really, really big inequality. All right, so when the rich go poor, you now are in a massive nosedive. All right, and with the vast majority of the United States well below the minimum standard of living, what we would kind of call the poverty line now, right? We really started to see that we were in a really kind of a dangerous game that eventually, as the United States, we're going to lose, but also on a world economic scale, everybody's going to lose. Now, one of the big questions is, well, why does the depression that happens in the United States have such a big impact on everybody else around the world? Well, it was because we were the main producers for a lot of these consumer goods around the world. Most of Europe was rebuilding after the war. Africa was still kind of in its hot and cold stage of independence movements and establishing themselves. So they were kind of behind the curve. Asia really wasn't technologically advancing. You had the communists in Russia. You had kind of the really messed up situation that was going on in the Far East with the Chinese civil wars, with Japan militarizing, yet it's a very small population. So they're not a huge impact just yet. They will, but not just yet. And we really just kind of see that because we are the epicenter of the financial world, when we fail, everybody fails. So in the fall of 1929, as we know, the United States kind of sets off that domino effect of stock prices and panic selling, and the Federal Reserve really isn't capable of stopping the bleeding when it comes to the monetary loss. So for a few years, we see just industry in general start to shudder, and by 1931, the Federal Reserve was increasing rates at such a high level that it was almost unbelievably expensive just to survive, let alone to be able to pay back your massive debts. So with those interest rates increasing day after day, week after week, year after year, those disastrous effects now start to really spill into multiple generations. All right, because people don't have the money to buy goods. That means goods don't need to be created. That means investing in businesses is less likely, right? And your banking system fails as a result of that. All right, there was nothing to back up or to create a safety net. All right, and that downward spiral of the economy, as we said, is going to just have ripple effects across the world. So because Germany depended so much on the American goods and the American loans, when we failed, they failed, and then that means they can't pay their reparations back to the British and the French. All right, and it's just a steady success of people not being able to meet the needs and pay the bills, for lack of a better term. All right, so when the Germans can't repay loans and the United States spreads across the world, everybody feels the stress. All right, but As we know, coming out of the Great Depression, we do see Herbert Hoover is not going to be reelected. We will see Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right, will rise to the presidency, and he's going to design this massive overhauled economic major program known as the New Deal to end the Depression and also to put the vast majority of the American working people back to work. And he does so through investing heavily, right, through borrowed money in building up the United States' infrastructure, right, making government work kind of the backbone of everything that is the American economy. Building bridges, building roads, building dams, electrifying the United States. We start to really see that we invest in the infrastructure, and then that infrastructure is then able to kind of spur on small business growth. So it was a plan, but it takes a massive amount of money and investment at the front end for any of this to actually pay off. Now, this is an extremely radical solution, and as we've seen around the world, there's going to be a lot of naysayers. There's going to be a lot of people that are against this idea of throwing a ton of money at the people and hoping that by putting them to work, it gives stability. All right, and those extremists, like, for instance, the individuals that we touched on with the Red Scare, like the communists, like the fascists, they are going to come up with their own undermining of the government. All right, and a lot of the anarchists, they're going to kind of be coming out of the woodwork at this point in time, and it's part destabilization, but also the New Deal is also part of unifying and galvanizing the massive majority of the people. You're not going to be able to make everybody happy, but the goal was, let's make at least 3/4 of the people happy. If we put people to work, it keeps them occupied, it keeps them invested, and they're going to be more likely to spend their money on goods that we can now start to see factories opening back up, and the banking system then reestablishes itself, and it kind of then takes that negative spiral that was happening and reverses it. So things look bleak, and obviously in times that are bleak, we know that radicalism and radical leaders are going to rise to the top. All right, as we know, human nature tells us, all right, if something isn't working, we're going to go to the polar opposite. And that's where fascism kind of finds its niche within Europe. People are upset with the democracies. People are upset with the status quo. All right, and they're looking for this different and very, very loud, boisterous voice, all right, to take them in a different direction. And the first person that really seizes that opportunity is the former journalist in Italy and World War I veteran sniper that was known as Benito Mussolini, or El Duce, as he will become known when he becomes the head of state in Italy. Now, fascism and communism, typically, they're misunderstood. All right, typically, we think and we group them together, but they are as far apart as they possibly can be. All right, it is kind of the belief that even though they do share some similarities, the differences really kind of spread them apart. So similarity-wise, when we look at communism, fascism, all right, they're both going to advocate for dictatorial one-party rule. That means just one party. We saw that with Hitler, with obviously the Nazi Party. We see this with Mussolini and bringing Italian fascism. We'll also see kind of the militarism in Japan will also mirror some of this one-party dictatorial rule. Basically, you eliminate any opposition or any other political viewpoints. Secondly, we're going to deny individual rights. It's more about the greater good than the individual positivity. So basically, it's what's better for the whole or the country, not necessarily what's good for you as the individual citizen. All right, they're going to insist on the supremacy of the state. As we said, country comes first. All right, they're going to scorn democracy. That's something they do agree on. And they're both going to advocate for some form of planned economy or command economy. Basically, government is big business and they control everything. That is a similarity that we typically associate more with communism because we know everything is nationally owned. It's federally owned. All right, fascism does that, but it's more about protecting large industry rather than protecting the country. It's not about evenly dispersing. It's about keeping the money in the hands of the people that are supporting the fascist rulers. And we'll talk more about that. All right, so the differences are going to be really where there's obviously the big separation. Fascisms want to maintain that class system. As we said on the last slide, the whole idea of fascism is to really kind of reinvest in the upper class aristocracy, the high-end industrialist, the very, very wealthy, because the very, very wealthy want to protect their wealth, and they're going to make sure that they support a government that does that for them. So Mussolini is a great example of that. His biggest supporters were the rich, the famous, and the industrial titans of Italy. So as long as he kept them happy, they continued to fund his endeavors. Communism, on the other hand, is different. They want to eliminate classes. They want to make everybody equal. And as we've talked about in previous chapters, right, we know that the basic essential needs aren't necessarily even always going to be met. So most of your population, roughly 95% of your population in communism, is going to live well below the poverty line. All right, as we talked about, the fascists are always going to align themselves with the high, wealthy, the aristocrats and the industrialists. All right, that allows them to do pretty much what they want to do, as well as keep up with the economies of a lot of the democracies and the republics. All right, that's why the Italians are able to pump out all kinds of consumer goods, because they keep the factory owners happy, and the factory owners don't see any type of decline in what they are able to experience. All right, we know that fascisms are extreme nationalist, and communist, on the opposite hand, they could care less what's happening inside their borders. It's more about spreading the communist idea outside their borders. So we consider communists more internationalists. They're more worried about uniting the workers of the world rather than dealing with the class situations in their own country. All right, and then one of the last ones, and this is a small difference, but obviously if fascists are going to protect the rich and powerful, they want to make sure they also protect the private properties. All right, so communists, everything's public, everything is owned by the government. Fascism, you're still going to have a little bit of independence. You're still going to have a little bit of your own individual wealth.
The leader has told them that the war is over, and now they will go back to their homes, and they will realize that in 7 months, Italy has accomplished one of the greatest military feats known in history. You hear now the band in the square playing, and the people are still calling him, and the balcony is still lighted, and he will appear again. Yes, he has just appeared at this moment, standing on the balcony, the lonely figure of a man who has led 34 million to this colossal victory in spite of sanctions, in spite of the hostility of the world.
Now, what you just heard was actually a live BBC broadcast that was performed when Benito Mussolini marched with his black shirt personal army of roughly about 10,000 troops into the capital city of Rome and officially overthrew King Victor Emmanuel III. Now, this is strategically important because Mussolini, after World War I, roughly 1919, became such an outspoken voice against the monarchy that he kind of became the face of the anti-Italian monarchy movement. And over roughly a period of about 3 years, he not only gained support, but also was able to kind of elevate himself to a national figure that eventually he had the support to be able to not only overthrow the government, but also really kind of undermine everything that the monarchy had built in the previous generation. All right, and this becomes kind of the seeds being planted for the birth of the fascist party, as well as King Victor Emmanuel effectively signing in his own death warrant. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. So El Duce becomes the head of the government with the March on Rome, followed by the 10,000 supporters known as the Black Shirts that marched with him into the city streets of Rome. Now, while this was a nonviolent kind of peaceful protest, just the sheer imagery of it was intimidating enough. When you've got 10,000 World War I veterans that are already upset, they're already kind of, they feel isolated and they felt like they had been disillusioned by the monarchy, you know, you're going to have a powder cake that's ready to blow. Mussolini knew that. Mussolini spoke to their unhappiness, the World War I veterans' unhappiness, and how things needed to change. All right, so as your military goes, typically your country goes. All right, Mussolini knew that, so he knew if he could rule with some strong words and a strong kind of ironclad fist that was his black shirts, the support would eventually follow, and he would eventually not only take over the country, but he would also be kind of the beacon or the pinnacle of what New Age fascism would look like. Now, they were the personal guard for El Duce before he comes to power, and then as he comes to power, they become kind of the elite of the elite. Now, the black shirts, they are going to be obviously the really only major entity that has any type of wartime battle experience. So because Mussolini was one of them, he was a World War I veteran, he had seen the atrocities of World War I, the military easily is going to fall in line with what he wants to do. Now, while he's aggressive and while he is very, very militaristic, he also did kind of keep in mind what were the needs of his country. And he does strengthen Italy in a very, very short period of time. So there are some positive things that he does for his country, but when we look back at history, it does come at a great price for him, because even though he was the originator of this fascist militaristic type of setup, all right, he is going to be stabbed in the back by individuals that are going to claw over his Italian power. Now, when we do look at his effective overthrow of King Victor Emmanuel III, King Victor Emmanuel III attempted to try and appease Mussolini prior to the March on Rome by offering him kind of a ceremonial position inside the government of Italy. Mussolini knew that this was kind of his foothold. If he could get into the government, if he could kind of swing some of the votes within the coalition government, he could basically get some allies before Victor Emmanuel becomes keen to the idea that Mussolini would eventually take it. So by Victor Emmanuel even allowing Mussolini into the government, that was kind of signifying that something was about to happen. He just didn't realize it because he didn't have the foresight to understand all of the moving pieces around him. All right, he was kind of an archaic world leader, and he had fallen behind the times. Mussolini was kind of that new cutting-edge 20th century leader. So when Mussolini does come to power, he becomes the leader of the first fascist party in not only Europe, but also in the world. So Italy becomes kind of the benchmark for what fascism should look like and does look like throughout the 1930s. Now, there are going to be other individuals that will follow in his footsteps. Adolf Hitler is a huge, huge believer and follower of Mussolini as he kind of begins to develop what is the National Socialist Party of Germany, the Nazi Party, and then eventually befriends Mussolini when he does take over. Hitler and Mussolini become very, very close allies throughout the 1930s, and not only militarizing their own countries, but also seeking that kind of third leg of the tripod that eventually becomes Hideki Tojo and the Japanese militarist. So with the upper class and the middle class really funding a lot of Mussolini's military expansion, the high inflation and the unemployment are going to lead to kind of some minor, almost like micro-communist revolutions throughout the country. Now, many of these micro-revolutions are absorbed by fascism, even though they're polar opposites, but it does kind of show you that things weren't as great as a lot of the fascist propaganda was really spewing to the rest of the world. All right, Mussolini had a pretty good grip on the Italian people, but he didn't have complete and total universal support. So by eliminating a lot of his, not necessarily oppressors, but his opposition, all right, he takes out anyone that could have kind of splintered some of the support for him. All right, so the middle class stays strong, the aristocracy stays strong, the industrialists stay strong, and of course, the military has his back. So he's got the money, he's got the power, he's got the industry, he's got the military. There's not really a whole lot that has the type of firepower to overthrow what kind of control he had. But things will change as we get closer and closer into World War II. And finally, we're going to see that Mussolini consolidates through the 20s and into the 30s, all power into his hands. He doesn't completely dissolve the coalition government and the legislature, but he has full control over the legislature. He has more than just veto power. All right, he's eliminated all opposition, and only members of his political party are in the legislature whatsoever. So effectively, he is the one-stop shopping for all political decisions and all control moving forward. So no more parliamentary democracy. Yes, people still had the ability to vote. They still had suffrage, but it was kind of a foregone conclusion. You were only on the ballot because you supported Mussolini and because you were willing to be Mussolini's puppet. And he's going to use as much force on the opposition as possible, and we'll see him use secret police to clamp down on opposition, send them to labor camps, and kind of set the stage for what will become that a very aggressive rise into World War II through the mid-30s into the official start of World War II in 1939.
I'm afraid we have a bad image, sir. Market research shows people see you as something.
So next time we'll take a look at the Soviet Union, and then we'll wrap up with Hitler in the next two sections. What I'd like for you guys to do is make sure that you kind of review this clip, look back over the slides on your own time, and then take the exit quiz when you feel ready. Make sure you double check your answers. Obviously, it is open note. All right, so get the right answers and make sure you take your time. You will only get one submission. Also, all right, in the coming weeks, what I would like for you to do is complete the vocab packet that is attached. Make sure that you guys are converting it into some form of Google Doc, something that you could submit on Google Classroom. You guys know kind of the drill on how we want to do that. Nothing changes there. All right, this will be kind of just like a homework assignment normally be if we were seeing you guys face to face. That will be collected on Google Classroom on April the 14th. That is Tuesday, April the 14th. Otherwise, enjoy your spring break, and I will see you guys whenever it is that I see you.